Right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the next in a series of culture conversations. So we have two experts today who are going to be engaging in a conversation and a bit of a discussion around how to use your employee communication to really infuse the positivity. Now, those two individuals that are going to be having the conversation this morning are Jo Geraghty from Culture Consultancy and Stefano Marrone from Nucco Brain. At this point, I'll hand over to perhaps first of all, if I can ask Jo if you can introduce yourself, and then we'll also hear from Stefano in terms of just himself and Nucco Brain.
Okay, thanks, Derek. So I'm Jo Geraghty. I'm co-founder and director of Culture Consultancy, and we design and embed organisational cultures, company cultures, to support the strategy of the business. And within that, we also design employee experience and the right leadership skills to drive the culture forward. Comms for us, although it's not the main part of our business, is very much part of our program design. So we have comms in a couple of ways, effective communications from an employee experience perspective, but also communicating through change in terms of large scale culture change programs. So that's us. If I hand over to Stefano, who is the comms expert, to introduce himself.
All right, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. So my name is Stefano Marrone. I'm the founder and MD of Nucco Brain. Nucco Brain is a visual storytelling studio. Our job is to tell the stories of our clients in an engaging way. We call ourselves strategic content creators. Our clients are mainly corporate and B2B clients, and the way that we serve them is by helping them with their content strategy and content production, whether that be video production, internal campaigns, comms, and external ones, anything from infographic to VR interactive projects. So we cover the spectrum of all different types of channels, and we do it for clients such as JP Morgan, Deloitte, the European Space Agency, De Beers, and many others. So I hope that I can be useful and say something interesting and insightful today.
Thanks, Stefano. Okay, so the thing around communication is that effective communication is one of those things that is extremely difficult for us to get right all the time as leaders within business. We're aiming to get the right message understood by every individual at the right time in a way that really suits individual preferences and to achieve the desired outcome. So it's one of those really difficult things to get right, consistently for every individual. At the same time, you've got, everybody is receiving our messages with a huge range of their own barriers and filters, which impact the likelihood of our message really being understood and having the desired impact. So, the landscape for communication generally is quite challenging. And then overlay our current situation in terms of a pandemic and the dramatic impacts it's having on all of our lives and our working arrangements, that adds even more complexity to it. So I thought I'd just start off with the two of you then in terms of a first question, just from your perspective and what you're seeing, what do you see as the biggest challenges leaders and managers are facing or will be facing as we look into the next phase of the pandemic and as we move through various stages of lockdown, etc.? So what are those big challenges? And perhaps, Jo, if you want to kick off in terms of your initial thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. I think some of the things that I'm seeing at the moment are really, or I think are going to be tricky to manage, is really the continuing uncertainty and change. There's still this sort of mindset of, we're seeing companies starting to get their people, geared up for getting back into the office or back to some sort of normality or the new normal. But really, there isn't any certainty even still, and the change is constant, and we still don't know if we're going to have further waves of lockdown later in the year, etc. So kind of managing that, okay, it isn't right, we were in this pandemic lockdown situation, now we're all back at work phase. It's not going to look like that, and I think that's going to be tricky. I think how leaders engage this sort of slightly fragmented workforce. We're going to have some people in the office full-time, some people working from home full-time, some people on shifts and rotas, and that sort of unsettled, bringing people back from furlough or not back from furlough. How are they going to deal with the different mindsets, the the different employee experiences that people have had whilst they've been off, because they won't have been able to keep that consistent. Everybody will have had their own experience depending on their life situation and what was going on for them. So I think that's going to be some of the most tricky pieces, is how do they reignite the employee experience, or how do they redesign it with this sort of constant uncertainty in mind? I don't know what you think, Stefano. What are you seeing?
Well, I think that I resonate quite strongly with what you're saying, Jo. And at the moment, what I think that there will be a rebound effect towards people wanting to try to forget this as quickly as possible. And because this is not, so many times this has been talked about as a comparison to a war, but the truth is that when you're in a war, you see the bombing, you see the damage, people are like, there is some physical element that is telling you, oh, this is something has happened and we need to rebuild. I think that the problem with the current situation, is that there is this kind of silent, destroyer of businesses, livelihood, and so on. So the people will expect that the second the lockdown is lifted, it's like, bam, back to normal, air quote normal. And instead, the things that we need to do, not only from a practical point of view, an office that was supposed to host our office with like 50 people in our, floor where we work. Now I will need to think about shifts, and similar bits. So that's quite important. But I think that there is definitely an underestimate or an expectation. When we talk rationally, it's like, yes, of course, it will take some time. But I think that there will be an emotional response that is like, oh yeah, now from tomorrow on, pam, it's back to what it was. And an element of this is that we all look for certainty in businesses, and the uncertainty will last for a time that will be much longer than the pandemic, because all sorts of results of regulations, financial aid that has or hasn't arrived, I can only imagine what will happen to accounting at year end, at the end of this one. So I think that is definitely the thing that at the moment I think is the sort of the part of the iceberg that we don't see, the unforeseen aspect of it, and that will be tricky to manage, as you say, because I don't think that in a situation where we expect to hold on to certainty, businesses, unless they lie, cannot just give that 100% insurance that yes, things are going to go in a certain way, and the economic backlash on a number of sectors will be huge for a long time.
So just thinking about it a little bit more from our people's perspective, what do you see as being their sort of needs, wants, and expectations? From because every individual is looking at the world and their work situation through their lens. What are some of the key things that therefore as leaders that we need to be really considering in terms of our people's perspective and their view of what's happening and what their needs, wants, and expectations are?
Given that we can't give them this, what they want is the certainty, and we can't give that to them. So the next best things, I think, are kind of, good quality information. So to the extent that you do know what's coming down the line, or you're at least planning what's next, you're starting to think through possible scenarios, that you share that information with them in a constructive way. People are really asking for guidance on, well, what are the back to work policies, what are the travel policies, what can you tell them, like, to put their mind at rest, what's going to happen to pay, what's going to happen at the end of the year, what's my situation. Then the more the better, as long as it is clear and accurate. What's expected of them, and I think, again, we often talk about the two-way communications, so it's not just being on broadcast mode, the listening to people, what are their concerns. I think there's a real need, and I think this is tricky, and I don't have the answer to it, but I think there's this sort of, the person wants to be treated as an individual, so that empathy for, do you understand what my situation has been during this? Do you understand how I feel? Versus the fact that they do need to treat everybody as equals in the workplace, and there needs to be some sort of generic broadcast comms. So I think that's going to be quite tricky, because the individual sort of saying, well, I want certainty for me, I want reassurance, I want to know what it means for me. So managing that, sort of balancing those two pieces. And I guess you can leverage your manager population to deal with a lot of that. But in terms of managing the messaging, I think it's going to be quite tricky to find that balance. What do you think?
Well, I think that there is an element, there are a couple of things that I would like to pick up. One is that there is an element, as you say, the high quality of information and the regularity is essential. But there is a part of repetition that I think is very often forgotten, meaning, we're seeing a lot of this MD or CEO coming down to earth and doing this one announcement, and then they disappear back, to the curtain. And I think that not having a physical place where they sit makes it feel even more, kind of ivory tower. Yeah. And there is an element of, when people, as you say, are so centered about their own security, you can be pretty sure that a big percentage of what has been said just, enters from one ear, comes out of the other, doesn't get registered from the brain. And I think that there is an element where, when we're talking about internal comms or HR comms, that there is a worry, and how we said it already, but I think that it's better to be, repetitive and make sure that everybody got the message in different ways. So it's like when you talk to somebody in another language, and instead of you repeat the same thing just with an higher voice, that's not how it works. You need to find ways to say the same thing in different ways to a different type of audience. Because as you were saying, it's like the expectation internally is very different, and I think it's very different depending on experience, but also on age range. So I think that the way that somebody that is in their 40s with let's say kids and a mortgage, those needs are very different from somebody that is maybe at their first or second work experience, where they might not be worried about the future in a sense of certainty, because they can afford to not be, but they're more worried about, is this now the environment where I'm working and I'm accustomed to, say, constantly being checked about my work, or have a reinforcing group of people around me that make me feel like I belong. And I think that the way that there is a motivation between people that are on the let's say the later side of millennials or Gen Z that are starting to work now, versus people that Gen X or older, it's really, really different. So thinking about yes, there is your broadcast message, but then how do I repeat this to the people in the right way? And I remember a campaign that we did for John Lewis, where we knew that it was for the pension scheme, that people that were 50 plus will react way better to a letter, and instead people that in their 20s, an email was more than fine. And for some sort of legal restriction, you need to send a letter to anyone. But what we saw is that, guess what? People in their 20s did online subscriptions, and people in their 50s and 60s went for the mail option for it. So I think is a tricky bit, because especially when you do comms and you have a product that you push out, you have an audience in mind, but instead internal audiences are very fragmented. The way you talk to the IT guy versus your account manager, completely different. So I think that's quite important to really think about that diversification of your inner audience. And I also think that there is an element for people that do comms to really take into account that you cannot be devoid of criticism. Like there's not a single thing that you will do that will sort of be a perfect solution for a lot of people, and I think that it's very tricky when you start using adjectives such as fair, because there is fair for the individual and there is fair for the group, and most of the times what you take is like decisions that are better for the biggest amount of people, which means that might impact certain individuals in a certain way. So I think that we really have to look at the tone of voice and not be generic when you use terms like that. because talking about the topic of this event is like the positivity element. What you don't want is to have this kind of blind, oh yes, we're all in this together and whatnot, and use terms that are a little bit generic. So it's a weird thing, but it's like get as much away from politician campaign slogan thinking as you can, because they act on vagueness, exactly, to try to capture vague sentiment, and instead people want from business certainty. So if I wouldn't say this is the first solution, I would say this is the first solution to the benefit of the majority of the people in the company, which is a slightly different way of opposing that,
Yeah, definitely. And I think, I've seen, I think I was talking to you about it the other day, but I've, seen some sort of disaster comms through this, where that vagueness and ambiguity has kind of led to sort of panic amongst people, because it's allowed space for them to read their own message into it. So they were starting to ask, people to color code themselves. Are you the reds who are going to be in the office, or the blues on the shifts, or but it read in such a way that there was sort of an implication that it was asking you to come back into the office full time. And there was a sense of panic amongst people who clearly weren't ready, who were thinking, I'm shielding, I'm my kids are still home from school, or whatever it is, that there was this sort of subtle implication. And I don't think they meant it that way, but it was poorly crafted, and it didn't help their cause. And on the youngster piece, I mean, I don't usually like badging people by their age, but it's funny when you think about the younger generations, that on some level, I thought they would have coped better with this, because, they want freedom and flexibility for the most part. They are, digital natives, they're conversing with all the tech that works for them. But actually, I've seen some research to support this, and I think anecdotally as well, that they've really struggled. They felt more disconnected from the workplace, and that might be to do with lack of life or work experience, or their home situation or something. But I think that's really interesting, that they're the ones that are kind of desperate to get back to the
I think that we have highly underestimated the importance of sort of learning by observation. And that's what's missing, is like, here we are, the most that I can take a look at you is like this past thing, but I don't see, how you sort of portray yourself doing an entire day. And I think that leads to, if you have lack of experience, not necessarily age, to a whole lot of second guessing that then generates anxiety, and that makes, productivity go down. And in that sense, I think that reassuring is very important. Like there is this one internal campaign that we did for HSBC that was called Serve, Empower, Grow, to tell what digital shift was happening to all the people that were doing client services for HSBC. And we made sure that there were some guiding principles that were very simple, actionable principles. It's like, these are the 9 things that we're doing. These are actions that you do that make people feel more self-assured, because they were doing more work from home, And at the end of the day, I think that we have to really think, what are those things that we have to do in comms that substitute that sensation of like, oh, this guy that is more senior next to me is doing this, and we mime them without even realizing it,
So is there, just thinking about that, about, Jo, you talked about an example there where it caused the wrong impact. Have you seen or heard of some examples where it's actually been done really well in terms of your organizational wide sort of communications? Is there some examples that we can reference? One
of the ones that's public that I think that's really interesting is the email that Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, wrote to his people. And I really liked that it sort of talked through his thought process. He doesn't know what's going to happen in the future any more than anybody else, but he kind of said, well, this is what I think is going to happen to the travel industry. And for that reason, I don't think these other businesses that we have are going to fly. And this is why we're going to close them down. And it's no reflection on the people that work in those businesses. It's just, this is what we think. And it was quite honest. It was quite, he showed quite a lot of vulnerability and really kind of talked people through what he was thinking. And I thought that was a really good example.
To be honest, there is so much that I see out there that it's tricky to pick one. I can definitely think about bad examples, but that's, you know,
That's always
for us, it's for us to go out and take a look. But I think that you know, there was a thing, going back to the John Lewis thing, that I really appreciated from the client point of view. While we were doing the comms process, they randomly picked people from different departments to give feedback at any given time. So sometimes I had to explain to a guy that was a fishmonger what this campaign was about, and then I had a top manager at Waitrose, you know, that never stepped into an actual Waitrose, and the fact that we needed to work with both, and they were randomly picked, made the campaign you know, successful, because it's like you have the best and less bias focus group that you can possibly have, and I think that that's very very important. And many times I think that workforces, you know, the way that you communicate is by thinking about what the bulk of the workforce is from a numbers point of view, but instead there are essential parts of the business that don't necessarily make the biggest number of employees. And I think that that's a very important thing to take into account, you know. So, you know, for my own business, if I think about, you know, we mainly have creatives that work as creatives, but then the mindset of, say, a producer, it's very different. And yeah, we have less producers than creatives, but it doesn't mean that we don't have to address that bit because their weight and the importance in the business of producer is as much as the one of creatives.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting actually, because in our sort of culture change programs, we'll often segment the population in terms of kind of where they sit or what their role is, or how kind of far along the change journey that they already are. I don't know what you think about this, Stefano, whether, you know, you tweak the comms slightly for, you know, where you think people are in, you know, on that journey, or where, you know, what type of mindset you think they have.
Yeah, I think that there is an element of it where we really need to take into account how people digest information. So, Derek, I shared with you a little bit of a slide. Would you mind putting it there so that I can talk through it? Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Derek. So, if you guys take a look at this one, you know, I think it's what we need to take into account. This is what we call the content journey. You know, we apply to every type of campaign, but I think it's particularly true for this type of stuff. So as you see, it starts somewhere and then somewhere else. But at the end, you have what is called you know, the fine print. So the fine print is really what you want people to finally absorb. The problem is that most of the ways in which you talk about this is that you try to shove the fine print at the beginning of the conversation, which is to send that, you know, 7-page legalese document that is filled in with little details that normally makes A, people freak out, and B, call their lawyers, and that's like an insane cost for the business from all sorts of point of view. You know, not only from a you know, from a time-consuming point of view of then having to address them one-to-one. So if you think about this, people digest content in different ways. To your point, Joe, and we always think about, there is a hook where you need to make people generically aware of something, and that might be your CEO communication, like that open letter that was great. But then, just like anything, people really need to be repeated, as I remember, you know, as I mentioned before, like there is an element of awareness. So I know that there is an ongoing conversation, you know, and then there is after they're made aware that something has been done, is when you can give them basic information and then more detailed information, and finally the fine print. But the hook can be very different depending on who you're talking to. So I think that if you're dealing with a younger audience that responds to things visually, that lives on digital, as you were mentioning, maybe a quick video or an image or even an infographic explaining something is something that can work well with them. And you know, that's actually something that we're doing at the moment with UKRI, where they're doing their COVID information. We're turning scientific papers into infographics so that people can understand them. And I think that while a manager can be satisfied with an email from his direct line manager, if you're talking to somebody that sees management as very far, then the hook and the awareness can be just a series of brief messages in a format that works with them. So I think that, you know, if you follow these steps, that's always a good way to think about how to make people digest information. Otherwise, they go into what is called, overload, and they freak out.
Yeah. I was going to say, especially at the moment, because I think people don't have the headspace. There's so much going on. There's already so much for them to deal with, just generally. So that kind of lengthy email, explaining this, that, and the other, I think maybe people read the first 3 lines of it, and then there's probably a very important message buried at the bottom that they just don't get to.
And I also think that there are all sorts of elements related to how do we best digest information. So if there is, let's say, a formula, as you were saying, like to calculate should you come back to the office on this day because you work this much and whatnot, that's not the type of stuff that you want to see in a video, because nobody poses a video to note down something that technical. That's better in actually a little bit of basic information. Say these are the 3 things for you to remember. So I think that I know it looks like a lot of work, but to be true, the 90% or 80% of what you do can be the same. It's just making sure that the sort of top aspect of it and how do you address things initially, even if the core stays the same, is different, and how the sort of what in advertising or comms you will call a call to action. You still need a call to action, and I think that a lot of times people are just like, this is the information, there's nothing for you to do, and instead you want to be able, again, to keep it positive, not in a blind way, but positive into somebody making them feel like they're actually acting on their own future, even if the call to action is, stay alert for new information, go on this website to know more or whatnot, rather than here it is and I'll let you know. And
I guess that's the thing. So, when we were talking about this a few weeks ago, people were very much in the kind of reactive comms phase. We're in the disaster, we're in the crisis mode. We've just got to get information out and get people mobilized. Whereas now, very much moving into okay, here's the strategy, here's the strategic comms going forward. They've got a bit more time to think about it and to plan it. And I think it's, from my perspective, I just think it's essential that people do that, so you avoid those kind of disaster messages that we've all seen, or the one I was talking about earlier. There was no reason for that to happen. They had time to send that message out. It wasn't a hard deadline, So I just think being thoughtful about your comms and sort of planning them is going to be crucial for the next phase.
Yeah, it's really changing, right? Because before you appreciated that kind of tactical, okay, I want information, even if it is imperfect, I'm going to get it. And now instead we're going to that, okay, you are not telling me the full story, what is happening. And I think, again, explaining that the expectation, people get communicated all the time by news, and the news change and the news cycle is very quick, and it goes, anything that is even a rumor from the government is newsworthy, and we're accustomed to get even, depending on how the situation changes, different government messages that are different from, let's say, from 1 week to 3 weeks afterwards, and we accept that. But we wouldn't accept that from a business, if you change tack all the time, that would just spread panic. So I think that is important to, showcase how and make people understand how there is a fundamental difference in how they stream information digitally, and because that's the difference. If you were in an office, somebody would just go and do a company address, of some sorts. But because the format is always this, and you get from your phone the information that comes from Boris Johnson and that comes from your MD, I think that our brain tends to think that they are the same thing. So we have to be extra careful and make an effort into differentiating it, because the channel that is coming through is the same. So I think that there needs to be a little bit of reflection on that.
So actually, and just on that, there's a question that's coming around, where you've got international workforces, and I think this equally applies to, if you've got multiple locations, it doesn't have to be necessarily international, but I think the international side of it really creates extra challenges. So how do you go about framing the communications to an international workforce that are used to, is used to working virtually, but all have different cultural experiences of the pandemic? So they might be used to this remote working environment, but the information they're hearing is influenced, also is impacted by what they're hearing locally, culturally, or what their local government. So how do you overcome, and what are the best things to do to be able to manage that effectively?
You have something on that, Joe? Are you okay if I take this one?
Yeah, no, you go first.
Yeah. So I think that there is an element there where there are several things that you can do, but the first one is to acknowledge the fact that if you have offices in 5, 10, 50 countries, that there will be, and there will always be, a list of when things are going to be done by. So you can say UK first, then Germany, then this and that. So certainty of the rollout, I think, is the very first thing to put out. But there are other things that I think work really well. For example, we did a campaign for Rolls-Royce that went into 40 different countries. And the question was like, how do we make sure that the people that listen to this in Brazil and in Norway receive the message in the same way? There are, I think, two important things. One is to make sure that there is a tone of voice that is acceptable on an international level if you're making the same message for everyone. And that might be doing a little bit of cultural research about the no-no things in different countries. Very famously, you cannot use too much white in Japan because that's the color that you use in funerals, and that's very specific to Japan. But if you have a Japanese office, you have to take that into account. And there is another element where sometimes we create intentionally stylized graphics or characters that don't make people feel, oh, here is our middle-aged white CEO from London talking to us in this other part of the world, so I feel that that's very different from me. So both in the HSBC campaign and in the Rolls-Royce one, we had this kind of stylized graphics and stylized characters that were not specifically with an ethnicity or anything like that. It's important that MDs and CEOs put their face into it, but I think that afterwards, what you don't want is to have that distance between the people that are communicating from you and you. So being very aware of how diverse your workplace and your workforce is, I think is important, because you have to generate a level of empathy. And if you cannot do it because of any reasons in your company with the people that are working directly, then I think that stylizing and using graphic elements it's a very useful thing. And then another element to that is like recognizing what channels and what IT works in which country, so it's a very commonplace for us to use Slack here in North America, but whenever we do things in the, let's say in the Gulf, we know that WhatsApp is as used for internal comms as it is, for even external ones. So we create WhatsApp specific campaigns. And I think that very often there is this, we use the channels of the culture that is the ad office, and instead we need to be a little bit more specific. And localization is not expensive nowadays, and I think that it goes a long way. Just translating something, changing the voiceover. It sounds like a small step, but I think that given the cost versus result, it can really make a big difference.
No, I agree. And I think it's the same when we work on the international, culture programs. We kind of have the philosophy that there's the red thread, if you like, or there's the base piece where this needs to be the culture across the whole organization. But then you allow for that sort of localized flavor, to the extent possible, try and, translate any surveys or anything we do, go out in local language, the focus groups, etc. But it's that kind of, how do you keep the baseline? So we say, yes, we are all part of the same group. We experience this culture, and anybody that interacts with us, feels that. But at the same time, there are some things that just don't work, even in other European countries, that just don't sit well. And it's about nuancing it without going too far, without going off on a tangent, but nuancing and localizing to that extent.
And I would say that even recognizing, like we're talking a lot about the candor and honesty in this moment, and I think there is an element where if you are, we work a lot with Nokia, that is like a Finnish company, and we had to get accustomed to finished type of comms, from them, which is like straight to the point, and something that some people would confess, oh wow, that's an harsh feedback. And at the same time, I remember the first time that an English client told me I'm not impressed, which means that we've done a shit job. And I think that if you have a certain way of talking and you cannot be spending a lot of energy and resources into making it very, very specific for any reason, maybe acknowledge that is something that would be good. Is like, this is a English first, or this is a, American approach comes. We know that it might be a little bit, different from what you're accustomed to, but this is what is our tone of voice. If you have any questions, having a lot of availability. And I think that, weirdly enough, the more you make yourself available with a clear channel, the less requests you get, I think that shielding yourself, when we did the John Lewis campaign, we put like the helpline number underneath at the end. And that was one of the KPIs where we want less people to call. It sounds counterintuitive, but the more you make yourself available, the more people feel secure, the less nagging questions they ask, because they're like, you're there for me. There's no reason for me to, panic and go crazy and try to reach you in 1,000 ways.
Actually, just build on that then. So, what do you two see as being the really critical factors in terms of how leaders should communicate, their style and the way they come across and how they present themselves? What are some of those key characteristics that you believe leaders and communicators need to be really harnessing, given the situation we're in?
That's one for you, Jo, I think.
Yeah, well, I think they've got no option but to be authentic in this era. I mean, that's been talked about for a long time, but I think nothing else will cut the mustard right now. I mean, that degree of honesty, vulnerability, authenticity, there'll be lots of things that you think, oh, can I share, leaders will say, oh, can I share that? Can I not share it? But if there are pieces of information that are somehow out there, they will leak anyway. So, and then you're going to look dishonest or inauthentic. And so to the extent that you can just keep communicating, even if you don't have the full picture, you communicate the part of the picture that you've got. I mean, just say, well, look, this is it, or these are the possible scenarios. We're not quite sure which way to go. I mean, even better from an employee experience perspective, if you can pull people into that decision-making process, even if they can't have the final say, you're not handing over the decision. But if you can say, well, what kind of future work environment would people prefer? How many people would like to work from home on an ongoing basis? I think the statistic at the moment is that 30%, on an ongoing basis, 30% of us are not going to go back into an office and are going to continue to work remotely. So, trying to pull people into that. But I think that kind of the leader being honest, I think cascading comms is another one. There's a lot of this leader broadcast piece, the CEO again from his bedroom saying, hey, this is what's going on, and the managers aren't necessarily equipped, so that there can be a disconnect in comms, or it's not being reinforced, or there's sort of a confusion because then the managers are not really sure what's going on, or they haven't heard that firsthand, they've just heard it in this broadcast. So what we've seen work really well in companies is, even in small businesses, is just who's your next line that are actually going to be there to discuss this message, to talk about what it really means, to talk about the impact that it will have on the individual, rather than the sort of the broadcast and deal with it, I guess. But yeah, definitely the authentic, honest leader, his time is now, her time is now. So
I agree completely. I mean, there is an element of making people feel listened that I think is essential. And the point is, I think there is a scare about it. It's like, oh, then how much time we would need to then listen, and is that going to impact productivity? So I think that most of the times it's just creating a channel that is clear, whereas like, this is the place where you go. You can even just set up one email that is like, COVID questions at yourbusiness.com, and for them to have that one place where to go. So like, feeling that there is one element there, I think is important. And to your point, Jo, I think that owning what the personality of a leader is, instead of trying to be this wartime assertive CEO, if that's not your jam, is if as a leader you're not that type of person, I mean, think about, not everybody can be Churchill, and at the same time Zuckerberg is owning his weirdness, as a leader and CEO. It doesn't matter whether people outside like him or not, but it seems that the people in Facebook are appreciating that, that sort of oddity that he has. And I think that you get incredibly bad result if you try to be what you are not. So in terms of authenticity, I think that's quite important. And the other aspect of training people of different levels, I find that it's quite easy if you just make people feel, even if you repeat the same information on a broadcast and to a smaller group of people they will feel responsible for it because you've done an address to specific levels of management. Even if the news is not different, even if they're not privy to some secret company plan or whatnot, it's just presenting it as, okay, you are middle managers, you are top managers, your responsibility is this, just to remind you, the key information is this, and that. Because at the end of the day, as mentioned before, it's about repeating something. And very much like in marketing, is universally recognized that you need 7 points of contact before somebody makes a purchase consideration. Why will it be different when it's related to internal comms? Maybe you will need 5 because these people are really interested in that, but expecting that 1 will be enough is just naive.
So is there, just thinking about that in terms of like the cascade and getting good communications working from top to bottom throughout a business, is there some things that leaders and managers can do to really empower or enable their people to sort of engage in that conversation and making sure that that's working effectively throughout the organization, rather than it all just being at the top, responsibility sitting at the top of the organization? What can we do throughout the organization to really fuel that effective two-way communication? Well,
I can give you my experience as MD rather than as comms, person, because that's I think it's an inner organization aspect towards it. And I think what we're doing is just making people feel very aware of their role. So I am a middle manager, and therefore I have 2 or 3 people that respond to me, or even if it is just 1 person. And that aspect of empowering that responsibility, I think, would be largely positive, and basically tell people, as long as you follow these guidelines, you have a level of autonomy into how you deliver this to your people, into one-to-one and things like that. Because I think that there is this element of fear. What if I communicate something wrongly? To a degree, I think that the biggest damage can be done at the middle management level rather than a CEO level, because most of them are media trained, or they're it's the type of personality that is quite strong. But at the same time, you have to make people feel that it's okay to talk and okay to make a very distinct, I think, impression between what you're, divide. This is my opinion, and this is what I think is going to happen, and this is what the official position of the business is. I think as long as that is repeated and made clear, maybe there is even just 1 slide, 1 document with the 5 key points of the information that they can go back to, and it acts as this like little safe thing that I know that if somebody asks me, I can just go back to these 5 things, and these are the key aspect. Then you can have a dialogue, and you can have a dialogue about opinions, but then say the certainty is this. The rest of it's us speculating as a team, which is fine, but don't make people fear or be afraid of speculating as a team, because that will happen inevitably. If it doesn't happen with the official emails, that will happen in a secret WhatsApp channel. You cannot stop people from talking to each other.
You can try. I guess, it sounds perfect. I think the thing that I'd add is maybe just like the comms, the way that the principles that we have for change programs are our 4 E's, which I might mention before, but that whole sort of educate, engage, empower, and enable. And I think I see this coming to life even more so through what we've been through recently. But the kind of the educating them, you know, through your comms, rather than just, you know, telling them or kind of, you know, trying to force the information, but that it's not instructing, it's kind of teaching them to learn and helping them to understand, I guess. So that's why we have the educate, and with that is the engage, you know, the two-way conversation. How do you bring them into it? How does their feedback get heard? How do you respond to their feedback, even if it's not necessarily what they want to hear? But how do you engage them on an intellectual and an emotional level? You know, this is the logic behind it. This is what needs to be done, and here's, you know, how it applies to your own personal values, or this is what it means to your, you know, job promotion or job satisfaction. And then I think the empowerment piece is key. You know, we talked a lot about empowerment when people on the remote working side of things, but I think that empowering them to be part of what needs to happen, you know, as you said, with even the cascading, the comms piece, but just generally, how do they own the changes? How do they own creating this new culture or new employee experience? What's their role in it? I can't help but feel there'll be a little bit of learned helplessness again at the end of this, when people get back into the workplace, of like, okay, the government has been telling me what to do for the last 7 or 8 weeks, and my company's been telling me what to do, and oh, now I've got to think for myself, or what am I allowed to do? You know, so there could be a degree of re-empowering people.
You're very right about that, because I think that there is a certain tendency at the moment to give away any sort of responsibility in a moment of uncertainty. And that's something that I'm seeing more and more around, is like, if somebody can make the thing they're responsible for from year to year, they will, when they don't know exactly what to do. I'm not saying that this is 100% of the working population, but I'm definitely seeing it as the world gets more complex, being assertive is more difficult, and this is the most complex and fluid situation that we could be in. So letting them go back to owning a sense of responsibility and empowering people, I think that, you know, we've used the term a lot, but at the same time, it's what it really means that is important to think about. You know, I mean, you do a lot of work here in this space, Jo. I think that it's been used so much that sometimes it can lose its meaning, but it's very, very important.
Yeah, I agree.
Do you have any suggestions on how to frame communications around the PTSD and I guess also the mental and physical well-being that this will all likely result in for individuals? So thinking about the impact on people generally, and how do we handle the communication around supporting our people, and how, you know, their own situations and how that's affected them?
A lot of people are talking about stress management, and stress management is not what we need. Stress management is like, something terrible has happened once, you know, for a short amount of time, and then you need to to manage those crunch times. You know, this is PTSD. You're having a sustained traumatic series of events, and the uncertainty clearly doesn't help. So in this sense, yes, it's similar to wartime. How to deal with it? I think that it depends on what your business is willing to provide, you know. So again, making people feel listened is essential, you know, and creating a channel of communication is incredibly important. I mean, I cannot tell you how many initiatives fails just because people don't know after that what and how to get in touch somehow. And it might be very, you know, clear to you. I have clients that, you know, it's like, oh, we cannot reach X KPI, and all they need to do is just to put a very clear call here or get in touch here element. I've seen businesses and work with businesses that provide mental health support or help. I think it's a very private thing, and doing it in a group can backfire or not bring the best results unless you have excellent coaching people like Jo supporting you. But if you can, as a business, provide some sort of support, a number of hours. I know businesses that are like, we'll pay for the first 3 or 4 hours of this, and that's the case. But also, I think that there is so much material out there, that free material that waits to just be used and picked. Like you can work with charities that provide free advice. We just did a job for a charity that talks about suicide and how to support them in an interactive project, and that's free and available for everyone. So I think that if you curate content that then ends up supporting the people who work for you, they will be incredibly grateful, and that's not crazy expensive for the business. I know it sounds like I'm talking in a shrewd way, but I know that comms costs are in front of mind at the moment for a lot of us. And I think that, there is a lot of content that you can curate with, and maybe do a little bit of a piece and say, these are the resources that are available for you, or even, a little videos or whatever it might be, but leverage internet in this moment, as long as you vet and make sure that the people that have written or provided that content is is good, and you watched it. There's nothing worse than you having haven't watched or read the content that you're gonna suggest. So I'll say, if you're honest and about the quality of what's out there, I think that giving them access to resources is one of the easy options if you cannot afford to for mental health support.
Yeah, no, I think that's all good. And I think there's a few things that we've seen work really well, actually, which is to Stefano's point earlier about repeating the message. I think is just to keep saying that we are here for you. We have got this level of support that's in place. It's okay to talk about it. It's not going to be detrimental to your career. There are no negatives, because there's still that perception, I think. So just really reinforcing the message, making it very clear what the contact details are, if there's support in place, what that looks like. I think the more senior people you can get to open up and make videos and say, look, I'm struggling with this too, I'm finding this difficult, then the more that kind of reassures them that there won't be anything. And then I think the third thing is really equipping managers. Large corporations have, a lot of mental health first aiders these days, that are there trying to spot who is okay and who's not okay, because sometimes people don't even identify in themselves that they're really not okay. So having those people spotting, listening, being involved in those conversations. But if you can equip your managers to be doing that, they should be having one-to-ones with people, listening to what's said and what's not said and what's going on in those people's lives, then that's really powerful.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I don't think that this means demanding less from your people, because I think that the risk when it comes to comms is immediately that this means that lack of performance, not doing your job well and stuff like that can be justified by the fact, we are in a stressful condition. And there's a fine line, it's just making sure that those opportunities are very clearly, laid out for them, and that the time of, leniency about performance is clearly defined, because what you don't want, as this is a good moment to create good habits, is also a very good moment to create bad habits. And I think that if people, are starting to do substandard work using that, the stress as an excuse, I mean, that's something that needs to be fought thoughtfully, but fought nonetheless in comms. And just there is a place and a time where, it's good to talk about this. Otherwise, you would see the stress creep up in the work. So the second that you provide a place where people can talk openly, I think that immediately takes care of people that leash out, in inappropriate times and places. It's better if you have a meeting every couple of weeks for people that feel stressed, rather than them talking dreadfully with a client because they don't have an output where they can do this. So I think that's quite important.
Thanks to Jo and Stefano for their discussion and virtual discussion over almost two people sat in a chair in a cafe having a chat, but over the internet.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. And if you, I've just put up the slide here with Jo and Stefano's contact details. So if you want to carry on the conversation all around this communication side of things, then feel free to reach out.